We are on the Hive Mind podcast, and we are talking about sandbagging in EDH and whether you should do it. Today's guest is Lion. And Lion, you want to briefly introduce yourself and tell the audience where we can find you?
Absolutely. So, yes, my name is Lyonix, but I go by Lion on the interwebs. You guys can find me streaming Commander on Twitch Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I'm a Commander host on Spelltable. Been having a great time hosting games for creators and players alike to join in and play during the late evening hours of the week. It's super fun. The platform is awesome. The people I've met are awesome, and the games are super cool. So you can also find me on Twitter, where I do a lot of my social media-ing, if you want to say it that way. But those are kind of the two main platforms I'm on. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's absolutely my pleasure. And all those links will be in the description or the show notes for anybody who wants to check out Lion's content. And I've actually been on his show a couple of times myself, and it's always been a good time. The community is really great. So definitely check it out. As for today's topic, we're talking about sandbagging. And sandbagging, for those who are not really sure what that means, in this context, it means holding back something or not playing something that would otherwise put you in an advantageous position. That can take many forms. It can have many reasons behind why someone would sandbag. And we're going to talk about what behaviors are appropriate for Commander, especially in multiplayer, and why you might sandbag and why it might be good or why it might be bad. I'm like melting because I don't have my fan on anymore. It's killing me.
You're good. You're good. So I'm actually quite intrigued by the way you described sandbagging there initially in regards to holding back cards that would otherwise win you the game. I actually, funny enough that you mentioned it earlier, I actually looked up the definition of sandbagging because I just wanted to make sure it was what I thought it was. What I got was more of a negative connotation of more of like a deceptive, and I wouldn't say the word malicious, but more of like a tricky, deceptive tactic players might use. Would you say when you describe sandbagging that you're referring more to somebody basically not playing optimally?
I would say generally no. I think playing poorly without the intention to do so is not sandbagging. I think that just poor play patterns are just that. Sandbagging, I think in general, it is tends to have this negative connotation with it, as if you're holding back because you're trying to make something else happen in the game. But a lot of times people will feel cheated by that. It makes the victories feel kind of hollow. So I think that the intention behind sandbagging matters a lot, because if you're playing poorly, then you're just playing poorly. But if you're purposefully not playing your cards because you're trying to see a different outcome to the game, then you're affecting the game asymmetrically. You have more control over the outcome of that game than you otherwise would, because you're not playing the actual cards in your deck.
Okay, so then I guess sandbagging can come in different forms then, because like you said there, I think you can sand like some people would be wanting to see a new card or something, or they just put a new card in and they're like they have a tutor in their hand. And it's like I could go get this to win the game, or I could go get this because I really want to play this new card. I think whenever I hear the term sandbagging, I definitely think it, at least in the conversations I've had with other players, it's always been of a negative thing where someone's basically lowering expectations at the table to basically take the table by surprise and win the game out of nowhere. That's usually how when I've discussed this topic with other people, what sandbagging has meant in the spheres I've been in. But what it sounds like, there might be different variations of sandbagging where it's like, yeah, I could have won on my last turn, but I wanted the game to go on longer. I didn't want to just win and end the game on the spot, so I didn't. I do think that could have a slight negative impact because I'm one of those players that would feel pretty not great if I knew that my opponent just threw the game, keep playing, even though they could have ended it. Because then I win later and I know that, oh, wouldn't have gotten here if he or she or they have just done what they could have done to win the game on that spot. I don't know. Have you ever had a situation kind of arise like that, or do you feel like you've run into people that have sandbagged in a negative way before?
I think when you're sandbagging in the sense that you're holding back a play so that you can catch people off guard later, I feel like it's more of a tactical decision at that point. It's not so much that you're wanting to change the outcome of the game as much as you're actually playing to your outs by not playing out your threats or making yourself less of a threat. I think in the context of sandbagging, you can definitely do it trying to have a positive outcome, like you said, extending the game and giving not only yourself but other people a chance to go off. And I've definitely seen that in my own playgroup where, especially if we have new players or returning players, we might play a little bit more loosely than we otherwise would, just because we want them to be able to experience the format and have that overall better outcome for them because they got to see more cards. Just seeing more cards is sometimes the better outcome between that and winning a game against someone who's not necessarily the best player at the table.
So I in that regard, I've done that in secret before, just because I wanted somebody to have a better game. Have you ever sat down at like a table and there's a player at the table, they haven't had a good game in a long time, they're on a bad losing streak, and you just don't solve whatever thing they're putting together on their board just to see them smile a little bit. Have you ever had that situation come up?
Absolutely. I play quite frequently with, if we only have three people for a pod and we bring someone in who hasn't played for a long time or isn't quite as experienced in the game, then quite often we will just kind of let them run away with the game a little bit just because we know that they might not play for months, whereas we could play almost every day. And I think that is, a positive thing to do. I think that's maybe even the morally correct thing to do. Give that person a chance to play the game, even if it might potentially be to my detriment towards winning that game. I've
So special about this format that you can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the multiplayer aspect of it means that everybody's contributions result in a sum that is greater than its parts. So when everybody gets a chance to play, it's more fun for everybody, even if the experience at the time was suboptimal for you or your deck specifically. Just being able to experience other people playing the game is a part of the social experience of Commander.
There's a way people go about doing this that is awful. It's when you do that and you hold back cards or you hold back plays to let someone do their thing and take off. And then once they've succeeded and once they've had their play or won the game, you immediately reveal that you didn't stop them. And I've seen this happen with, I feel like players that are a little less mature, I want to say is the term. I don't mean to say this as like a dig at anybody who has done this, of course. We're all players, we're all trying to have fun. But, if you're trying to set somebody up, feel good about something or let them have a good time, the last thing you want to do is basically kind of let them take over the game and win. And then basically tell them right afterwards, yeah, no, I want to let you know, I totally could have stopped you there. I didn't want to because you were having so much fun. Like that is a feel bad right there. I don't know if you agree or not, but
Absolutely is. It's a feels bad. It makes the victory feel like it wasn't earned. And I also feel like it makes you feel bad about your plays because you were playing against a threat that you didn't know was there. I feel like not being able to solve the puzzle of a different board state makes it feel like you were just handed the game, and nobody wants a non-game to happen.
right. But you want players to have fun. So it's like if you're going to do that, obviously the right way about it is to do it. And if you really need to vent about it or something or it's really bothering you, talk to a friend, but just keep that, let them have that victory, let them walk away with it,
It's kind of like telling a white lie. It's like, it doesn't really matter if nobody got hurt.
Yeah, it's like it's a secret you basically going to carry it with you forever if you don't say anything, but it's like it's a game, right? We're all just trying to have fun, and it's so unique to this format because you're never going to see something like that. I mean, I guess you could see that in 1v1 formats if you're introducing a new player, but when two people are really playing the game to try to have fun, you don't really have that social atmosphere of making decisions like that in any other kind of game, at least anything I've ever played, let alone a trading card game where people are even talking about the idea of sandbagging somebody. It's really, really unique and special. And I think it's fine to do that as long as you just put yourself above the situation and you basically keep your mouth shut about it, right?
I think there are times where it's practically morally correct to sandbag. And I do think that the context matters a lot. This is very much unique to Commander because in other games, if you're sandbagging, like if you're playing, especially in 1v1 style games, when you're sandbagging in a 1v1, it's always a tactical decision. You're almost never going to, what's the point of playing a 1v1 and just throwing the game away? You're not really getting anything out of the experience by letting the other, it's, If you had a child and you're letting them win a game to see them happy, that's one thing. But when you're playing against people who actually want to play the game and engage with you, then it's kind of a whole different context because they're not getting the whole experience of the game because you aren't playing at the highest level that you could be.
Yeah, and something that can really paint this contrast well is comparing CEDH to regular EDH. And what I love, I come from a background where I have a lot of friends and I know a lot of people that have played and do play competitive CEDH. And I, as a casual player who plays very high level understanding of the game, have seen the contrast between playing at a table with people who are all extremely capable and extremely smart, know exactly when to cast their instance and what to tutor for, how their decks work. They even know your deck almost as well as you know your deck. Those games are a completely different animal. And I don't think you'll ever see sandbagging in the term where you're basically just trying to help someone have a good time happen in games like that because the decks are all super optimal. But then you sit down at a casual-ish table, it doesn't even have to be casual. It could just be like a higher than normal level game of Commander. And that social atmosphere just hits the table super hard because you're all coming together for a good time. We're not all there to play CEDH. We're there to play out these decks that have themes and stuff like that. And we all know that they're built to a certain degree. And I feel like sandbagging in the term that we're talking about usually is aimed towards a player they're not at the same level as everybody else. I'm trying to be really careful about how I describe that, but I know experienced players are going to know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that some players step into this game and they're not as well versed with the rules. They're not as well versed with what cards do. Their knowledge pool isn't as great. And you really can't hold that against someone. I know if you have a great understanding of the way the game works and you have a vast pool of knowledge on, if he's playing this commander, I know exactly what cards are going to be in that deck and I know what makes that deck win. That player is going to have a severe advantage over the rest of the table. Whereas a player who's just started like a couple weeks ago, bought a pre-con and upgraded it with some really cool cards, has watched a couple videos on YouTube on Commander gameplay and is really excited to play, their outlook on that game is completely different. I think a mature player will recognize the difference in level there. And that's where sandbagging will usually take place, is when the more mature, experienced player wants to see their friend who is sitting down and looking to have a good time have that good time. And like you said, I think that's when it's acceptable and almost morally not required, but it's a responsible thing to do because that's what's going to keep new players coming back. It's like you don't want to invite your buddy over for a game of Commander and then absolutely annihilate him and say, "Oh, that was fun, right? You want to come over next weekend for another match?" That person might not want to because you completely smoked them and they're going to feel like they're outclassed and it's going to take too much for them to get into the game. Whereas if you let them win, they might get the bug,
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have a great experience with this. And by great, I mean awful. I had a player, this was a good friend of mine, and I brought them into Magic for the first time, and we played Commander, just 1v1, just, casual, just what I had on me. And they got thoroughly, thoroughly roused. They got harassed, they got bullied, and it wasn't intentional. And I wasn't playing like an extremely overpowered deck. The decks were about equal power level, but they were just new and they just did not know how to really utilize the deck as well as I knew how to utilize the one I was using. They got a bad taste in their mouth and now they just refuse to pick up the game, even with the IPs they like now in the game with Universes Beyond. And it's a really bad feeling that they're probably never going to come back to the game as good as it is just because they had that initial negative experience. And they could have their own reasons. Maybe they just don't like card games and things like that. But it puts a real bad taste in my mouth that was their first experience. And in hindsight, I wish I had sandbagged and let them have some fun and make some cool plays.
I think there's a way, because once again, we're in a unique situation where there's more than one player at the table. Let's just take that example and say that you're playing with that person. There's two other players at the table. Perhaps one of those other players is a pretty experienced, well-versed player. You can really hide the fact that you're sandbagging by throwing a lot of your resources at other players that are experienced, simply by using the reasoning of, that person, I played with them before, I know this person's really good. And you can throw those resources at that person, allowing the person that you're quote unquote sandbagging to basically go unhindered, wallflower almost, while the battle's taking place between two other big powers. They can kind of rise up and take that position of, once the two powers have weakened themselves, they take that spot in the lead. That's a very common cadence that you'll find in games of Commander, where one person really takes off right away, everyone else gangs up on that person, and then one of those players usually makes a play that overturns the tide of who's winning and takes the lead from them. And typically it's does that person maintain that lead, or do they get dropped down by everybody again and follow that same rinse and repeat pattern throughout the match? But you can really use that as like a curtain of, I want my friend here to win the game. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make optimal plays against these other players. So that way the game still feels authentic. It still feels like, hey, I'm playing these cards, I'm tutoring for this, I'm sacrificing to draw 3 cards and then board wiping to stop that guy, but purposely kind of nonchalantly ignoring some of those cards for that one player. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. When someone is in this situation, they're going to feel like maybe they're just making optimal plays anyway, that they're not necessarily sandbagging, but they might be quietly making that decision to ignore the underdog in the situation.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. So I looked up the other version, or I guess the other terminology for the term sandbagging, and I found this to be quite intriguing, because this takes it from talking about sandbagging at a level where we're discussing, mainly doing this for players that we feel want to, or have had a bad streak of games, right? I think there's other ways that you could sandbag in that fashion, right? Maybe just wanting to see a new card in your deck. Maybe that's, I don't know if that would be technically considered sandbagging, because I've done that many times where, I'm playing my Nico Bolas deck, and that deck is built all around Dragon Reanimator. And I played Buried Alive and gone, okay, I could easily go get Udvar Hellkite, Terror of the Peaks, and Lathlis and go nuts. But what I'd rather do is go get some of these other dragons that I just put in the deck and see how they perform, because the deck has different like lines of play, right? So it's like every deck's always going to have the most optimal line. I mean, would you consider it sandbagging to ignore the optimal line for another line of play? Even though that line is still effective, you're just not going for the most optimal in the situation. Would you consider that sandbagging?
I would say generally no. I think intent matters a lot. I think if you are intending to play suboptimally in order to let someone else win or let someone else get an advantage, I think it would be sandbagging. But I think playing for fun and making the fun play, even if it's suboptimal, is just how Commander goes. I think it might feel like sandbagging to not get something that's going to help you impact the board better. But I think that's more just you making the decision that the cool play is more net fun. And more net fun is, I feel like, the outcome everybody wants. Winning isn't necessarily a big part of Commander in the multiplayer aspect of it. You want everybody to have a good time, and that means getting the reactions you want from the cards that are in your deck. So definitely when it comes to things like tutors, I think getting the thing that's going to produce the most fun is always the best play, but I wouldn't consider it sandbagging.
Gotcha. All right. Well, can I share a story?
Absolutely. Let's hear it.
So I encountered I was sandbagged. I was sandbagged. And this was actually not all that long ago. And it didn't feel good. So let me kind of explain where I'm coming from here. So painting a story here for you guys. I'm at this table playing some Commander with 2 people I know and 1 person I don't know. This person it was at an event. This person was walking around looking for a game, and they came by our table. We had one open spot, and they were like, "Hey, can I join you guys?" And we were like, "Yeah, totally. We need a 4th." So this person sat down, and we introduced ourselves. It was awesome. This person was very pleasant, and we went into that conversation of, okay, what's everybody playing, or what level are we playing at? And we all kind of just explained, because the 3 of us, it was my wife and one of my best buddies. We'd all kind of said, hey, we don't really play infinite combos, but we like to play decks that are pretty strong. So whatever you'd like, as long as it's not going to be like rip the rug right out from underneath everyone immediately on fast mana everywhere and stuff. And this person was like, yeah, cool, I got a perfect deck for that. So they pull out this Shorikai deck, and I kind of knew what Shorikai did and stuff like that. I'd seen some decks, and I was like, okay, I know this Commander can be built in a way that's not like destroy everyone all at one turn 4 kind of thing. So I was like, okay. And this person was like, yeah, this is my Shorikai deck. I really love it. It does a lot of cool stuff with artifacts and a lot of token stuff. So I was like, we were all like, okay, cool. So we start this game going, and the game's going pretty good. We hit, I want to say it was turn 5. And this person had, casted some 2 to 3 mana rocks. I think there was a mana vault played at some point. Totally fine. I run mana vault in some of my not competitive decks as well. But they had Shorkai up by like made some pilots, had turn 4, I think casted an Anointed Procession or something to really increase their token generation. So flying through that theme that they were talking about, they were making tokens. So everything seemed fine. I think it was either turn 5 or 6, everything kind of exploded at this point. It was because this person that sat down had casted a mass polymorph spell. The minute they put that card on the table and said, I'm going to cast mass polymorph, I remember the sinking feeling in my gut. And I immediately asked the person, I said, how many creatures do you have in that deck? And they said, I have 8 creatures in this deck. And I was like, okay, cool. So this is a mass polymorph deck. They had like 8 tokens in play. They flipped Avacyn. They flipped all these huge angels. Eldrazi came down. And I was like, whoa, okay. So if I knew that this deck was built around this interaction, like I would have definitely made some different choices. Maybe destroyed some of those enchantments and permanents over there. Now, while that was really cool to see, the person withheld the information about what the deck did. It just kind of by saying, oh, yeah, this is just a token deck, really cool artifact synergies. And then I asked at the end of the game, I was like, so is that what the deck's built to do? And the person was like, yeah, that's the main line of play is I dig and I tutor for cards that let me get the tokens and play to polymorph them into like Avacyn. And I can't remember what the other cards were. I'm pretty sure it was Kozilek. There was Sarah's Emissary. So there's just a lot of stuff. And after that, the person was like, all right, cool. Thanks, guys. Scooped up their cards and left. And I'm just kind of sitting there like, well, I feel like the game would have been way different if I had that prior knowledge what that deck did. In my eyes, in my mind's eye, that's what sandbagging is to me. That's like what I feel like I've experienced it personally the most is basically it's deceptive behavior intended to lower someone's expectations so that they can be taken by surprise later. Basically lulling someone into a sense of false security so that way you can just kind of have this massive uninterrupted turn later. It didn't feel good. What do you make of that story when I tell you that? Because like I know a lot of people would be like, no, that's fine. Their deck did the thing, and that's totally cool. What are your thoughts on that?
I think when other people think of sandbagging, that's exactly the kind of story they expect. They expect somebody to go in being deceptive. But that made me think is not only is sandbagging just behavior in the game, it's also kind of the deck building and the presentation and having the rule zero conversation. And I didn't really think of it like that before. I always kind of looked at it as sandbagging being this thing where you're in the game and you're making decisions to maybe you're being deceitful and you're underrepresenting your board or you're underrepresenting the threats you have.
I like that term, underrepresenting your board.
But I didn't really think about it, the idea that you might be going into a game and having a rule zero conversation before the game even starts. And I don't know if that's necessarily fits within the definition of sandbagging, but it definitely feels like it. And I think that's why there's such a negative connotation because that's kind of what people think of happening when you talk about sandbagging. It's very rare that you see sandbagging in a positive context where the aim is to make everybody have the opportunity to play the game and have a fun time. Generally speaking, you're not going to hear those stories because no one talks about it when that happens because you don't want to make the game seem like it wasn't real or that the plays you made weren't real. But I definitely think that's the definition most people would have is that story exactly. But in fact,
the word sandbagging just has a bad sound to it right off.
It does. It does. Yeah.
I think sandbagging is a nice thing to do, or
It's a very strange thing because when I was growing up, I live by a river. And so we would sandbag the river. We would fill sandbags with sand and put them on the river so that when they overflowed, they didn't take over the town. So for me, I always see sandbagging as like this protective thing. And I think that's the context I go into it with is like, I want to protect the game from ending. I want to protect the game from being boring, from having this bad ending, or from this situation where everybody's having a bad time and they wish they weren't there. I think it's really important to respect the time of your opponents and to respect the fact that they chose to sit down and play with you. So to me, I have this like protective connotation with it where you're could have this positive intent behind what you're doing. Actually, I have my own story here where I did this recently. I actually was playing a game with my Ratadrabic deck, which of course got a huge upgrade with the Ring Tempsu from the Lord of the Rings set. And I actually had a combo ready to go. I had the outlet in hand, I had the combo on board otherwise, and I chose not to play it, even though I could have just won the game on the spot because I knew it was going to be boring and I knew everybody was going to have a bad time if we had to shuffle up again so early in the game. Everybody was just setting up and I chose not to do it. And, my board got interacted with a lot. I had to fight through it. It was a lot more fun for me. And I think it was a lot more fun for everybody else at the table too. But after the fact, I told one of the players that I had the combo in hand and I could have just won the game. And, he told me it was lame. And I felt really bad about it because it made the decisions that they decided on not feel real. They lost agency. Even though we might have had more fun in the moment, losing agency feels bad.
Do you feel like there's a way that you could solve this whole idea that sandbagging might be necessary sometimes to certain people at the deck building stage of building a deck by potentially just limiting the deck's power purposely so that when you walk into a game that is going to be with players that aren't as well suited or well versed, you're basically you're sandbagged. It would be walking into a game with a deck that holds you back because you built it to hold you back, because in your heart of hearts that you're there to play. You're going to go for those lines. You're an excellent player. You're very smart, you're very calculated. And then when you have those lines in the deck, it's really hard not to go for them because you know how to get them and you're very efficient. But if you build the deck in a way where the deck doesn't have those same lines, it doesn't have that level of strength, you can still play as optimally as possible. But that optimal level you built has a limit because you imposed that limit at the deck building stage. Do you think that would reduce the amount of sandbagging you'd feel would be necessary for situations like that?
I'm not really sure on that. I think
It's an interesting thought, right? I mean,
it is. And I think some people would definitely agree with that sentiment. And even people in my playgroup have had similar sentiments where they wanted everyone to build these not poorly constructed decks, but decks that were just intentionally slower, playing things like tap lands or just rough alternatives to better cards. And I never really liked the idea because I found that making the game slower doesn't make it more fair. There's always going to be a best deck. There's always going to be a best combo available to the people who are playing. And making the game last longer by virtue of having less resources doesn't let you play your cards anymore. It just makes the game go longer, which I don't think is necessarily a positive thing. I think playing the cards is the more important thing. So I think in the deck building stage, I don't think you should make your decks weaker so that you don't have to sandbag. I think that you should just have a better rule zero conversation and say, this is the power level we're going for, and bring a deck that's appropriate. That's easy to say, and it's a difficult thing to assess power level, especially with strangers. But I think just making that conscious decision to have that conversation and, letting people know, I have tutors, I don't have tutors, I have fast mana, I don't have fast mana, I'm playing a combo or I'm not playing a combo. Just having that conversation is going to prevent sandbagging on its own. I don't think you need to build a subjectively worse deck just to prevent a mismatch in power. I think that's just going to happen regardless. And if you built a strong deck, I would rather you sandbag so that somebody else gets to play. I would rather have you sandbag and, feel free to use your resources on me. I don't care because I want the total experience for everybody there to be better. But I don't want you to play a worse deck and have a worse time just so that you can play with people at a different power level than you or play with people who have different experience than you. I don't want you to play a tap land every turn and not get to play your spells because you want to not be overbearing and you don't want to hold back your resources. I would rather you just be at the same power level so that everybody's more or less on an equal footing.
That is kind of my deck building philosophy. My collection I actually use different deck boxes to represent this, but my collection of decks consists of tiers of strength. And I actually keep certain decks in a certain box, and I call it the black box. That's my box of decks that I built to be exciting the way I want them to be exciting and play well the way I want them to play well. But when I build new decks, sometimes I'll tell myself, I'm like, hey, what I want to have in my collection is I want to be able to bring my decks with me to an event and sit down at a table and say, hey, I've got these 3 decks that are all extremely good. And I've got these 2 decks that are good, but they're not going to pop off the way these can pop off. And then I've got a couple precons that I brought with me. And I actually love Wizards of the Coast for making the pre-constructed decks at the level they make them at, because I feel personally, after playing pre-constructed games where you buy a precon and just play it the way it is, I've sat down in groups and we've all just busted out unaltered precons and played games. And I love Wizards of the Coast for making those, because those decks are usually very well balanced, even though they're playing tap lands like you were talking about and playing like suboptimal cards. And it's like, you ever just look through a precon list and gone, why is this in here? That's like leaving those cards in there and then just playing and seeing, who's going to be able to do what with what the deck list consisted of. And that's kind of like my philosophy when I have these decks, is it's like, I'll sit down and be like, all right, what are we playing at? And in my head, and then with my experience with the decks I have, I can usually say, all right, this person has been playing for a month. This is their Will Help deck. They've edited it and they don't like infinites. So, okay, cool. So what I will play is I'll grab my Hydra deck, which is just mono green stompy creatures. And it's like, usually like I'm able to basically judge what's going to match up well. But I built my decks to be I want to use the word spectrum almost of strength, because in Magic, the Gathering is inherently a game where you have to be paying attention to that if you're going to play in a multiplayer format consistently on a regular basis. And it's more important, I think, not so much for people that are going out to shops and playing with random people or going to events or, cons or anything like that, but playing with regulars, especially like if you have a group that gets together every Saturday or whatever, like I do, you got to be really careful. And almost everybody, not necessarily meta build their decks, but you all build decks that are within reach of each other. That way the games are fun and exciting and you can mix match the decks for different games. Otherwise, you end up being that player that everybody knocks out first because your decks are too good. Or you run into the situation where you got a sandbag. I really, in the definition of sandbagging, where we describe it as holding back to let someone take off, I try to limit situations where I have to do that. My goal whenever I'm teaching someone how to play or whenever I bring someone into the play group is to get them to a level of experience and knowledge to the point where they don't need me basically allowing them to do what they need to do. Because it makes me feel like I'm basically sitting there kind of being like a chaperone in the game, which is fine, but I do love playing and going for those wins. My favorite game is where I'm sitting down at a table and I am not the person everybody's eyeing as the best player. Everyone's on equal footing and we're all playing decks that are strong and all trying to win around the same time with their own styles. Those are my favorite games. And I have no problem sitting down, though, to play with players with less experience. It's just consistently, I would personally, for me, prefer that sandbagging was a minimal experience for me. That way, the players can feel like they earned their wins. I can feel like they earned their win. And I don't have to always basically hold back the thought that, oh, I could have toxic deluged and then casted living death or something or whatever. Instead saying, yeah, you truly did best me. Like that was good. You took your skills and you played well. And that was a battle hard earned and well fought. And that comes from me just being a competitive person. I'm a weird mixture of competitive and Vorthos. You were aware of what those terms mean?
I am, but if we want to, I don't know if we want to, go over that for the audience who might not be familiar.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I build this weird mixture of competitive and theme. And when I can get the balance mixed right, I almost feel like Guy Fieri or whatever, or like a chef who is just cooking up something and just like hit that spice perfectly,
Hit that flavor town.
Yes. No, that is my favorite way to play. I know everyone has their own. That's one of the beautiful things about the format, but it's like, as an experienced player, I don't have a problem sandbagging somebody for the first few games, but if I'm sandbagging them, at the point where it's their crutch, they're not getting better. I feel like I start to kind of tire from that. And I'm like, well, I would really like to start helping this person beat me. I often do that. I don't know if you have ever experienced that, but you'll be sitting at a table and I'll go, wait, hold on, before you do that, notice that if you do this and this, you'll actually be able to stop what I'm about to do. Because if you're watching my board too, you'll see I'm actually about to be able to do this. Sometimes they'll be like, oh, I didn't even notice that. Or sometimes the person will just say, no, I just like to play my cards and then pass the turn. And then they're like distracted by something and not really paying attention. And at that point, I feel like I'm way more invested in this game than they are. And at that point, I lose my drive to want to help them. Have you ever gotten that? Because I feel like it's different for everybody. You get the players that sit down and are super engaged and some that aren't. You feel initially like you want to help sandbag the player that's not winning or very often, but then you realize, oh, they're not winning because they're just not paying attention very well.
I think that can definitely be the case where people are not invested in the game. There could be any number of reasons for that, but I think that what you mentioned, if somebody is new or returning or just not very experienced, I think that becomes a time and place thing. It's a time and place to sandbag in order to get them that good experience, to get them to learn to play the game. But the optimal situation is that nobody is sandbagging, that everybody's playing to the best of their ability. And that's where you want them to be. And that's why we give players advice and say, like, hey, if you do this, it's going to be a lot better for you. You should play, you should play this thing at instant speed instead of playing it on your turn, which is something you commonly see with less than franchise players, is people waiting till their turn and then playing their instance, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I see that all the time. I'm kind of a dick about it.
I see it all. I'm guilty of it too. I've definitely done it where I just, especially on Magic Online, I'll cast my instance just so I can F6 and just not have to pay attention to what's going on anymore. But that's a little bit different than just like not being aware or not caring about the advantage there. I also wanted to talk about the precon thing a little bit because I also love playing with precons out of the box. It's a tradition for me and my friends, just each go get one and do it. And to do that before we even try to adjust it or take things out and put things in. But I do think that it's really important to understand that you should be playing these decks within the same cycle. So like the Lord of the Ring precons are just miles ahead of like the 2015 precons. If someone sits down with and says, I have a precon, I need to know what you're actually playing. Because if you're playing Duretti or Zedru or whatever, and I'm playing a Lord of the Rings deck with all the new cards in it and it's really strong, my precon might be a 7 and yours is like a 5. It's important to understand what's going on there.
I haven't really run into that issue personally.
I think it's actually really problematic. I think that precons are only getting stronger and stronger. The only thing that holds them back is the variance in the tap lands. The cards are definitely getting stronger. Like the Duretti precon is probably not a good example because Duretti was actually really good. But there's definitely precons out there that are really not great. But then somebody could say, I'm playing a precon, and then they're playing Edgar Markov, It's like that deck, even just out of the box, is really, really good and would probably trounce some of the other precons that are available before Eminence became a thing.
I agree with that, I guess, in a 1v1 stance. I think the 4-player kind of helps mitigate that a little bit, at least from my experiences, because the precons that I've owned in the past have been the Cat Tribal deck. And then currently my precon of choice is the Tyranid deck. And I've played against Prosper precons. I played against the Nekuzar precon at one point. I played against not the Edgar Markov one, but the Wizard precon, a lot of the different Strixhaven precons and stuff. And most of the games, we have enough of a pool, I feel, of matches between the guys that I play with on Saturdays where people are winning based off of interaction, where it's like, if, for example, let's say the Edgar Markov player overextends their board and someone board wipes, that person has been just completely bushwhacked out of the game because they invested in their board way too fast. And it's like, I think it does have a lot to do with how you play those decks. But I haven't personally run into a precon that I felt was too strong to play any one of my precons against. And maybe that's just me playing these. I mean, maybe the Tyranid deck is stronger than I thought. I mean, when I was watching people rate those, I think the Necron Warhammer precon got the highest rating in terms of strength. I've played the Tyranids against a couple Lord of the Rings precons and felt totally fine and fair as long as, I was playing my interaction well. And then the other players were playing their interaction well, just because like whoever took off first usually got snipped. But I don't know. That's always been my way to, like, if I walk into a game and someone's new, I'm picking up a precon just because I don't trust myself with a strong deck. I'm going to want to do the cool things. It's what the decks are built to do. They're all built to do the cool things. So I often find myself having a hard time sandbagging because it's like, if I have a spell in my hand that would just do this insane play, it's like by not casting this, I'm just like, either A, they're going to know. Some of the people I play with now, they're just going to know I didn't go for it because they know what my decks can do at this point. Or B, I have to lie and say I didn't have it in my hand. Sandbagging, when I play with people longer, the longer our relationship goes, feels less and less viable because that person begins to, because then eventually I will play a very optimal game against that person, whoever is playing. And then we'll play a game and they'll tell me and I'll hear the words, "You let me win." And I'll be like, "No, no, no, no." And they'll be like, "Yeah, you did. Like, you can't even hide it from me. Like, I swear I know what you were doing. And you totally could have done this instead because I've played against your deck enough times." Maybe that's just the guys that I play with being competitive, but that really just kind of circles back around to sandbagging itself being in a time and a place, almost like you said earlier. And how often do you feel like sandbagging is relevant within your space?
I play with a lot of super casual players. So I think that playing casual as in they're not like buying entire booster boxes, they're not buying the commander decks every time they come out necessarily. They're just playing with the collection they have. They still want to play Magic, but they only play it when other people are already playing it. They don't go out of their way to join groups. They're not in Discords, that kind of thing. So they might be playing like a really strong deck, but they aren't necessarily the best player. I have a Krenko player, in my play group who's pretty casual. And even though Krenko is really strong and it's a really good deck, and he's definitely stolen some wins from under us, I would still not necessarily target them with my best cards. I would probably go for someone else first. I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily sandbagging, just to use my removal where I see a bigger threat just because I know what the decks are capable of. It's fair to assess things and use your removal accordingly or however you want to interact. But I think when you're playing with people who don't get to play as frequently as you do, I think it's appropriate to not completely destroy them given the opportunity just because you can. And I think it would feel pretty bad if I just blew Krenko out of the water just because I knew that they weren't going to be able to do anything about it. I would much rather contribute to the game in other ways and watch what happens and see if they're able to develop a board than deal with that. I would rather solve that puzzle of dealing with the board that they develop or make my opponents deal with it. The multiplayer aspect adds a lot to it, but definitely I think if you're in an area or in a play group where you have casual players joining in and you don't have regular, really experienced players, or at least as experienced as you might be, then you have to think about that. You have to consider that, but on a game by game basis, where you might want to either play decks that aren't as powerful, or at least play in a way that isn't going to unfairly take advantage of the fact that they are less experienced than you.
Do you have a special deck that you play when you know you're playing against good players?
When I'm playing against good players or inexperienced players?
Good players. Like let's say you're sitting down and everyone at the table is like a solid, well-versed player, and you all are there for an exciting, like competitive match. Not CEDH, but competitive. It's CEDH without the trying to win as fast as possible. You're trying to win. You're trying to win. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Do you have a deck that you sit down and play with, like, I'm busting this out because we're here for a real good game and I'm going to play as optimally as possible, but it's not CEDH? Do you have a deck like that?
I have some stronger decks, but to be honest with you, I don't get to play them that often. I don't get into that situation where everybody's able to play a super strong deck and not have it be CDH. We tend to like completely jump that step. It goes from we're playing casual jank right to CDH. I have had decks that were really strong, but I think that the context that they were strong is just that they were different and that they just had access to powerful cards. I play a lot of Izzet and Grixis For those of you who don't know, I'm a Grixis fanboy, so I play a lot of strong cards just because it's such a strong color combo. And, I've played background decks that I think were absurdly strong for what they were, playing dragons with Feywild Visitor. It's doesn't seem like it should be very strong, but they definitely take over games. I would have to probably look at my Mox field and see what's really, really good. Like I've played Ratadrabic. I don't know if I've played it on your channel. I've definitely played it. Oh, maybe I have. Did I play Ratadrabic?
I have. I think I remember there being a Ratadrabic one time during a game.
I know I definitely played Ratadrabic and just sort of sandbag because I didn't play an infinite combo. I know I've played Samwise Gamgee on your channel and had like to avoid combos because they were like baked into the deck and I couldn't avoid them, but I didn't do them. But that was more like respecting what the playgroup's expectations were. That wasn't necessarily sandbagging because I wasn't doing it to change the outcome. Like we all agreed beforehand that we weren't going to do combos. But with Ratadrabic, it's really, really strong, but you can play it not that way. You can kind of play it not poorly, but you can play out the cards that are more fun because there's a lot of cool interactions in the deck. For like a high power, I would probably still play Ratadrabic, but I would just not do the cooler plays. Like I would just like present a threat consistently and make people solve it. Because to me, that's what like a fun high level game is solving complicated board states and like really tough threats and cooperating with your, the other opponents on the table to make sure that you don't lose the game then and there.
That's what I love to do as well. I like a good, exciting, strong game for me is all about board presence. If I'm filling my battlefield up with cards, it's not necessarily having the 2 or 3 best like right cards that just, and that this is why I've got that rule on my channel for the infinite combos thing is my optimal game of Commander is as strong as you can get without going infinite and without playing just like metal core stacks, or it's
Right.
just like, okay, no one's playing Magic. And that's how I win the game. Like that, those are the 2 points of Magic that I have not yet dipped my toe into. Not more so because it's like I haven't gotten there yet. I think it's just like I don't personally believe I would enjoy Magic at that level. Then again, I've never sat down at a table with 3 other players that are all playing at that same level. But I have sat down at a table where I've had one player sit down and be like, hey guys, and then play this extremely overpowered deck. It's almost sandbagging in the opposite direction. Instead of trying to bring one player and like leave them alone and basically feed them, you're gunning one player down because you know that their deck is way too good. That's a stigma I don't love in a pod. I don't know. Is that reversed sandbagging almost?
It's still sandbagging. It's just, or it's not sandbagging for you to attack that player. But I feel like the player who brought the overpowered deck was kind of sandbagging by not representing their deck well. Or maybe they did. Maybe they came in and said, hey, I'm going to play Arch Enemy. Try and stop me. 3v1 me, please. And that might be the experience you're going for, when you talk in your real Rule Zero conversation. It is completely acceptable, correct, and the right choice to attack somebody who is playing outside of their power level, but also just generally speaking, if someone's really well off on the board, don't feel bad about attacking people. Don't feel bad about removing their stuff. Don't feel like you have to play nice. That's not sandbagging. It's not sandbagging to play nice. Just because you didn't kill your opponent's commander on site doesn't mean you're sandbagging. Again, I don't think that there has to be this negative connotation with sandbagging, but that's might be what you're thinking is that you're playing too nice, and that's not really a problem when somebody brings a problem commander, or if someone brings a combo to the board and they're threatening to win the game, that's you need to interact with them, and it's perfectly fine to do so. You don't have to feel bad about that.
I always thought of the term sandbagging in the way it sounds. It just makes me think of a pillow fight where I have what looks like a pillow and you think it's a pillow. I'm about to smack you with this pillow, but it's actually a sandbag. I don't know. That's not right.
Have you ever like carried sandbags?
They're heavy, aren't they?
They're extremely heavy. They're just full of sand, but they're also burlap sacks and they just cut into your arms. It's extremely uncomfortable.
I believe it. So that's what I've always whenever I heard the term sandbagging, that's what I've always thought is you have what appears to just be this bag, but it's when you get sandbagged, it's heavy and it sucks and it's unexpectedly heavy where you toss a sandbag to someone here, catch, and they're like, oh, I'm going to catch this and it's not going to be that heavy. And then boom, it gets hit and it knocks them down. I've always thought of sandbagging in that terminology. That maneuver only works like if you're trying sandbagging only works once if you're trying to do it like that because you play that one game where you sandbag someone and then they know about it then after that.
If you're a gimmick deck, like I don't blame you if you want to sandbag for one game so you can do the gimmick because it's really funny.
That's what I felt when that Shorokai deck sat down and he played Polymorph. I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I'm like, all right, well, if I play against that deck again, they don't get tokens because then they're just going to polymorph them. So you have to basically focus that guy before he makes the play that makes him unstoppable, you know?
Right. And it can be tough to have your rule zero conversation if you're playing gimmick deck and you really want it to be a surprise. If it's funny, then you have my permission to sandbag if it's funny. But if it's just like overpowered and you just want to do this overpowered thing because it's cool, maybe then tell people like, hey, I'm going to spit out big creatures. I'm going to spit out Eldrazi and Avacyn's, and you need to potentially be prepared for that. Like, maybe don't tell me how. Don't tell me you're a polymorph deck, but tell me like I am going to cheat things out.
So I think there's probably people out there that inadvertently sandbag. They don't even realize they are because they want their deck to do the thing and they're excited about it. What they don't realize is that their deck is gimmicky. I mean, like, I feel like there's people out there that don't quite understand that they built their deck to be that way. And then they feel the only way they can get their victory is by sandbagging because they didn't include any other things in the deck for the deck to do, you know? I think that's a pretty unhealthy thing for players to fall into. But I feel like the people that have that issue at a point where it is unhealthy are people that don't realize or anything like that, right? So, like, for example, one of my best friends that started playing the game way back when I started playing, like, he had built this Kalia deck, and it was a Kalia deck, and all it was built to do was cast Kalia and attack. And after his first games with us, we all realized, oh, if he doesn't have Kalia out, then he's going to play really slow. So we started nixing Kalia, and then that deck immediately became so unfun for him to play because we knew how to beat it. It was a linchpin deck. It was a glass cannon. And I feel like there's a lot of players out there that don't even realize that they've built themselves into this corner of sandbagging in a negative way where they feel the only way they can get their victory or the only way they can get their fix, quote unquote, is to be deceptive about what the deck does in their games. So then that way they can get what they want and then scoop up and walk away and have a good feeling of, well, I'll play that person or that group one time and do my thing once and then walk away so I feel good about it, but can't play with them again, you know?
Right. I think you see that a lot more in like random LGS pods. And
Yeah.
you see this a lot on Magic Online. Regrettably, I love Magic Online. Definitely, like if you think you'd enjoy it, invest in it because it's a fun time. I love it. But it's quite frequent that people will bring a very strong deck into like a casual pod. There'll be an open pod and they'll say casual, and someone will just bring their CEDH deck or whatever they want to bring, and they go off and they win the game, and everybody's had a bad time, and they don't care because it was completely anonymous. They don't participate in chat. They're getting ragged on in the chat box, but they don't care because they just wanted to see their deck do the thing, even if it was at the expense of other players' time and play experience. So definitely the negative connotations come from that deceitful nature. And I don't know, I really wish we could decouple sandbagging from that negative connotation because it's more accurate to say that person is just being a bad player. They're just being a bad sport. But again, this can be unintentional.
This is sandbagging.
Yeah.
That we're kind of bouncing back and forth between.
Yeah, it's more complex than I think people want to talk about and get into because there's this kind of implication that it's always deceitful, but we've also talked about ways that can be positive and ways that can kind of be a redeeming factor, but I still think there are times and places that you want to do it, but I think those come up less frequently for most people. So you just don't hear about it. And no one wants to talk about the time they they lost a game on purpose. That's not a fun story for people.
I think it's just the people that you play with. And I use the word competency. I think it's probably not the best word to use when I talk about players, but there will be players that are more competent than others. And like you said, sometimes that person just needs to get a victory under their belt to not feel like they need to deconstruct their deck. I've had guys that have played and they just lose 3 games in a row, and they sit in there and they're looking at their deck like, this deck sucks. This deck is awful. I hate it. I haven't gotten a victory with this deck in 3 weeks. I'm deconstructing this. And in my head, I'm like, no, don't do that. There's other reasons why you're not getting your victories. It's not the deck, there's so many other things that you're not even looking at here. But then at that point, I feel like I want to sandbag in the sense of I want to feed that person to victory, because I don't want them to feel like this. I don't want them to feel like they're not having fun. But I think there's a level of the level of competency of a player being, how well do they know their opponent's decks? How well do they know the Magic the Gathering database? It's not required for a player to have every card memorized, but if you know what cards do, that inherently makes you better. And I've had a lot of players that just, they sit down, they know their deck so well, but they don't know other players' decks, and they lose games because of that. They lose games, they feel bad. And then I'm like, oh, I don't want this person to feel bad. So instead of me sandbagging, my go-to thing is I just pull out a weaker deck and I let him kick my butt. I'm going to play as optimally as possible. That way I don't have to lie to you about how well I played. Mm-hmm. You can feel like you got a victory over me. And I personally know that this deck was built to play slower. So when you took off and you just stomped me, you did stomp me. And I was trying to stop you. I was trying to beat you. That way, can you see the balance I'm aiming for there? I'm aiming for, you're not necessarily sandbagging by holding back plays. You're sandbagging by playing a weaker deck. I think it's a different form of sandbagging.
I think the player skill adds a lot to it. So even though the deck might be a little bit weaker than some of your other options, your player skill makes up for that. And I think that effectively brings the power level up to the appropriate level for that player. I think that's perfectly fine. I think that's outside the realm of sandbagging, because you're not holding back. You're playing to the best of your ability. You're just have access to not as powerful cards. I don't think you should build your decks to aim for that. I think you should just have a variety of decks. If you're privileged enough to be able to have multiple decks, having a precon just around is great, or even just a slightly modified one, however you want to do it.
I think when I walked into this, I think I had a different definition of sandbagging in my head.
I think it's great. I think it's great that we came in with different definitions, because we had like a lot to talk about, like where that context came from. Like I had like this more positive, or not necessarily positive, but like a more helpful aspect to it. And we're kind of fighting this negative connotation and having this back and forth. I actually took a lot of inspiration from this, from the game nights episode on sandbagging.
Game nights episode on sandbagging?
Or not game nights, command zone. I'm sorry, I just conflate the two in my head, but there was a command zone episode about sandbagging, and I completely forgot about it when I was planning this topic. But what
did they mean when they said sandbagging?
I don't even remember. I'm gonna have to rewatch it. But it came up in my feed when I was like doing research for this topic, and I was like, oh yeah, I forgot they did that. So it's kind of like silly that I'm also doing it. But the reason I wanted to do this podcast is because a lot of these topics don't go explored in the way, like the thoughts I have don't ever get talked about. And a lot of times I find that other people's opinions and their thoughts also don't show up on other people's podcasts. So I really wanted to explore some of the other thoughts. And anybody that's listening to this, obviously you're probably going to have some strong opinions about this. And if you disagree with our opinions, just let me know in the comments, so that, maybe we're completely off base on this and we're completely wrong, or maybe it's a local thing and where you live, sandbagging might be considered a totally different thing. But I wanted to have this conversation because I think that people don't talk about these concepts enough, and when it's appropriate to do things in a multiplayer format.
It all harkens back to the format, man. This is so unique to Commander, and it's the conversation you're not going to hear people talking about or having regarding other games. Like, it is state of the art. It is innovative. It is cutting edge that a game like this exists. I don't know. Maybe I am just a complete noob to card games or board games. There's probably board games out there where people have these conversations, but you don't build decks.
Next episode is sandbagging and Monopoly. Stay tuned.
Can't relate. I play Sorry, and I definitely sandbag a specific player when I play Sorry. But no, it's stupid how we have this combination of players pouring their personalities into the decks they build, playing with their favorite cards, their favorite artworks, their favorite styles, amongst all 5 of these different colors of Magic the Gathering, catering to legendary creatures that they love, that they want to play with. And we have to have a conversation here about how to treat other players during the game. Like a whole nother level of interaction that you don't see when you boot up a video game to play, like even like role playing RPGs. Like there's nothing like this. Everyone's just trying to win. But what we're aiming for is we're aiming for an experience. But we also want to win at the same time. Like it feels great to win in Commander. And it feels great when you build a deck and it does something exciting. Like that's what we're all aiming for. But you're also trying to get all your opponents to have fun too, instead of just completely kicking them into the dirt. I mean, most of the time, quote unquote. This is so stupid unique. And I think it's one of the main reasons why a game like this, a format like this, can hold at least someone like me, it can hold my attention for what has almost been 9 years now. We're getting close. I have never held on to a game or a hobby like this before in the gaming world. I think it's so special that we have to have this conversation about sandbagging players. You know, it's crazy if you really think about it. And it adds a whole nother level of dynamic to a game. It's why you can play Commander over and over and over. And I could have people over every Saturday for the next 2 years and still be having a great time. And your playgroups are so unique and special. And your conversation about sandbagging is going to be so unique and special because sandbagging to me means something completely different than what sandbagging means to someone else. Maybe sandbagging doesn't even happen in certain playgroups. Someone's going to listen to this and they're going to be like, what is sandbagging? That's why they're going to click on this video. They're going to be like, what does that mean? And they're probably going to walk in like me thinking sandbags are heavy. What does it mean to sandbag somebody? What does that mean? They're going to walk in thinking it's something like that. And they're going to learn the definition that you gave, Wayne, where it's like, oh, sandbagging is where you're basically protecting somebody. You know, this is so special that you can have a podcast like this. And I don't know, it's like you said, probably going to be people out there that have completely different opinions. But then again, I wouldn't love this format so much if everybody just agreed with us. I mean, that's just me being all rambly right there. But I think it's one of the coolest parts about Commander. You know, I have my own goal when I sit down at a table. And Wayne, you're completely different from me, man. Like we sit down, I want to play this big, cinematic, powerful game. I want to be able to lay in bed the night after that game, and I want to be able to play a movie in my head of the events of that match. That's my optimal game. I want to be able to view my opponents in my head, casting their spells, having their big climactic moments during the game, and then eventually the dust settles and we're all there and there's one person standing on top. And it was an epic fight. And no one was pulling their punches. We were all going for it. But at the same time, I, as a player as a person who loves teaching and hosting and inviting people in to play this game, will totally be okay with having a new player come in and letting them have some fun. At some point, though, I have a goal for that person, and that's for that person to be able to play optimally, to play well. So it's like I have my own goals and my own expectations and wants for the format, and that affects heavily how I interact with other players. You could probably say the same thing, right? But in a different way.
Absolutely. I cannot agree more with this sentiment, and the fact that we're having this conversation right now speaks to the multiplayer aspect, the social aspect of Commander, and Magic in general is just the respect these players have for each other and the desire to have this cumulative experience. And I think we absolutely hit the nail on the head with regards to the time and place and making sure the players are able to enter the format, have fun, learn, and get to the point where we don't need to take care of them anymore. We want them to have the same experiences, the same fun that we're having when we're having these high level play games. Ultimately, it's better for the format that we do that. It's better for the players. Everyone has a better time because everybody got to have that experience of getting into the game and falling in love with the cool, amazing things you can do, casting the spells, the playing the big creatures, the spell casting, the spell slinging. I don't know which one I'm going to keep in the cut, but but absolutely, I think that it's such a unique experience, and the fact that we're here and talking about other players and making sure that they're able to participate is so unique and so special.
I think it's also important too for players to respect other players' expectations and wants. We're all adults here and we all want to share and having a fun time. So if someone wants to play a strong competitive match, if you can, oblige them. Or if they want to play precons, oblige. It's like, and then hopefully they do the same for you. If you want to play a certain deck, you want to have a certain kind of game, they would oblige. I got some friends that really love playing Planes Chase, and I know those games can go on forever, but they like the Planes Chase cards. So it's like, sure, you got it. Let's do it. And trying to get everybody into a point where they're playing the decks they love. But I'll tell you right now, I'm in the same boat as you. I have a deck that I love to play. It is my Yawgmoth Thran Physician deck. Extremely fun. It paints the perfect picture of what I would be if I were a mage of some kind, but it is very strong. That's what I love about it. Is I love how strong it is without crossing over the line of going infinite with anything. But I don't play it very often because it's a deck where it's got a warning label on it. I think Brian Kibler said that in an episode of the YouTube channel at one point. It has a warning label on it. When I sit down, I got to tell players this deck is powerful and it plays black cards like you've never seen black cards played before. So maybe perhaps like you have always seen black cards played. It will kill your creatures very often. And I got to tell players that I'm like, if you would like, we can play a game with this deck. But I'm going to tell you right now, this is an evil villain deck, man. I'm gonna be an evil villain. Some players love that, and I love it when other players love that because then I can play that role. It's a true role playing, and I can sit down and be like, "Hey, I'm gonna be an evil villain. You guys got to defeat me." I've had games where I've been able to take 3 players down, and it's been so fun. Like I really felt like the Ganondorf to the Legend of Zelda series. I felt like the Thanos to the Marvel universe. It was so cool, and it felt fair though because I gave each player had turns where they could cast their spells and they could try, they could help each other. And I've had games where I've lost and gotten knocked out first, and even then I felt okay. But like you said, it's all about that rule zero conversation. And if you were to ask me if I like sandbagging, I would tell you if I had to give a black and white answer, it would be no, because I like the games to be authentic. But if you ask me, will I sandbag? It's yes, if it's appropriate, like you said. And will I walk into a pod with my Yawgmoth deck without telling people that it's going to be extremely powerful? Of course not. I've played so many games with it, and I know how strong it can be. Even if I get smoked, I know how strong the deck is. I won't feel bad. I'm not going to feel bad at all. I've got so much experience with this deck. But I guess in the way we were talking about earlier, like I said, I think I sandbag in a way where I build with decks that are less powerful because I hate holding myself back. I hate looking at cards in my hand and saying I could cast this right now, but I'm not going to just because I don't want to hurt this person's board and I want them to have fun. I would much rather have no answer. So I will build decks that are lower on the interactive side of things so that way my opponents can, in what I feel, more authentically achieve wins. But I still think that's sandbagging in a way where I'm not holding back cards in my hand. I'm holding back cards from the deck. That I do that often. I'd say my weakest deck right now was Casla, the Broken Halo, and the deck's coming apart because I wanted to build an optimal deck out of it. I feel terrible because I can't stop myself. I have a fever for building decks, and it's crazy. But I think that's going to leave my Kodama of the West Tree deck, and it's not weak by any means. It's had some strong games, but it folds so easily to board wipes and stuff. And I think I'm okay with it because if my opponent board wipes me, then sure, let them win the game. They got it. But if I can cast this Hydra and it stomps you for 25, then that's cool too. I mean,
Yeah, I think you gave us a really tidy conclusion there too, which is the ideal is to not have to sandbag. The ideal is to never do that, but it is sometimes necessary, and it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's how you use it, just like anything else. This is going to be completely random, but I just wanted to talk about it so I can get into the video because it's something that I think is unique. I get critiques on my deck list quite often because one of the ways I power down my decks is by not playing tutors. I don't play any of the big tutors. I don't play the top deck tutors. I'll play like land tutors, like the ramp ones, but I don't play demonic tutor. I don't play vampiric tutor. I don't play mystical tutor. I don't play those. I like to draw into my cards naturally. And some of my decks even go as far as having no combos at all, and they are just pure grindy decks. And that's how I like to just play lots and lots of on-theme cards, even though they make my deck weaker, because it's kind of a win-win where I get to play the cards that are fun and interesting and unique to my deck. But I also don't have boring non-games where I'm just getting into combo pieces or I'm getting into game-winning situations just because I have tutors in the deck or I have combo pieces in the deck. I want to play commander with my commander and play commander center cards. And I find that's a really good balance. And people quite often critique my decks over that because I'm not playing tutors or I'm not playing some kind of easy to include combo. And that's so ideal for me that I just don't understand it. I don't want to play tutors because it's so incredibly boring for me to not play the cards that are actually fun and interesting and unique.
People seriously come after you for not running more tutors?
They do. I posted recently a link to the Missy deck, and this is in relation to the upcoming, and this will date this video, but this is the upcoming. Why am I forgetting the name of the series?
Universes Beyond.
Yeah, I'm talking about the actual release with like Missy and the Daleks. Doctor Who. I don't know why I'm just blanking on that. This is from the upcoming Doctor Who commander decks. And I built a Missy deck and I really, really love it. It's got lots of moving pieces and lots of like unique interactions and there's combos. And I immediately got told, like, take out these combo pieces, add tutors, add just generic cards, generic advantage engines. And I'm like, no, because that's not why I built the deck. If I wanted to build the deck as a generic deck, I would just build any Grixis card advantage engine in the command zone. I'm playing commander because I like the commander and what they do. I just don't understand why people do that to themselves. Like, to me, like, more power to you if that's what you enjoy. If you really enjoy optimizing the deck, please try CDH because you will love it because it's much more your speed potentially. And I love CDH. I'm a huge CDH player. I would play it way more often than I do now if I could find regular pods. But when I play not CDH, whether that's high power or casual, I want to be really, really on theme and have lots of cute interactions with my cards. I don't want to play tutors. It's just not fun.
I'm friends with a guy that runs a Discord server for a competitive Animar build. And he's one of those players that if there's a better card out there, that's what he's playing. And him and I used to have a running joke because I used to play the Scrylands a lot, and I still kind of do sometimes. And I would always, whenever we were at a pod together and we were playing like not quite so competitive Magic, I would turn one Temple or something for a Scryland, and I go, nothing feels better than a turn one Scryland. And he'd always go like, I mean, playing a dual turn one feels pretty good into like a Mox. And I'm just like, well, I'm playing this Scryland. And he would always try to like talk about how those cards are not good. And I'd just be like, I'd tell him, I'm like, dude, I mean, you are clearly a CEDH guy because this card is a non-card to you. There are so many cards where I will go to this guy and I'll be like, listen, this card's cool. And then he will pick it apart and tell me why it's bad and why other cards are better. And I simultaneously love that and hate that because what it does is it helps me become a better player because he's right. There are better cards. And I love hearing what's better. I love it because it makes me better at the game too. But at the same time, I don't want to play those better cards, you know? So I think CEDH is healthy for casual players. And I wish more casual players would watch CEDH because it helps you build decks the way you want them to be built. And you can also still play really strong games. And kind of like to your point, so I think I'm getting a little off topic, but to your point regarding players just picking your deck apart and telling you that you should play different cards, you are 100% in the right by just saying, no, I don't want to put, like, I don't know what's in your deck list, but I'm going to use some generic examples. I'm not putting Rhystic Study in here. I am not putting Cyclonic Rift in here. I am not playing the best. I'm not playing like Vampiric Tutor in this deck. They're clearly the best cards. If you wanted your deck to be more consistent, you play more tutors because the tutors guarantee you get the cards you want. whenever you want them. Tutors increase consistency, which could be a bad thing if you're trying to include some longevity in the deck. If you want the deck to be able to be played more frequently and not get boring faster, don't include tutors. Include more lines, include more ways to draw cards, more ways to create a board, more ways to close a game, instead of tutors that narrow your ways to win games, but will increase the consistency of which you win those games. I don't love that. I get bored. I got very bored of my Lord Windgrace deck at one point because it would always win with Tormented Hailfire or Scapeshift. And I told myself, I'm like, I need to put some cards in here that just make a board. I want to be able to attack. I want to go to combat. And I had to do it because the consistency was killing me. The deck got boring. You can't own a deck for a year and win the same 3 times, or like with same 3 lines over and over and over again, and still love that deck. I mean, maybe some people do. I can't. At that point, I'm taking the deck apart and I'm building a different deck because I'm bored. I think that's the revolving door of Commander, because I build new decks all the time, and I'll own a deck for like 6 months and be like, okay, this deck only wins like by playing these 2 cards, and I don't love that I need those 2 cards every single game to win. So what I'm going to do instead is build this deck that, for example, one of my favorite decks, my clone deck. I love it so much because it never wins the same way. It is always winning based off of what my opponents are playing, and I love that so much because the deck is like a mirror, and I will always play something different every game. Whereas the consistency that tutors bring can make those decks feel a little less fun. Has nothing to do with sandbagging, but I just wanted to talk on the point of which people were critiquing your deck and why I disagree with them. And I think that tutors can be fun.
This is not a dig on people who like play tutors. Like, I have people in my playgroup who have very fun, interesting decks that play tutors, and that's just how they enjoy the game. They enjoy finding the best thing in the moment. They might not be playing combos, and you can certainly, like, the lower power a deck is, the more you can kind of get away with these things. So, like, I've had like a Dika Fractal Theorist deck that was super, super jank. All it did was make vanilla creatures. That's all it did. And I played all of the fast mana, all of the free counter spells. I played every strong card that I could play in mono blue, and the deck was still terrible. You can account for your power level based on what your strategy is and how you're playing, and it's not wrong. It's not incorrect. To make that quasi related to sandbagging is that you are not sandbagging. If you're playing strong cards in a deck that's really bad, that's fine. You don't need to sandbag there. You don't need to hold back if your deck is so bad that like a mystical tutor will just get you into the game. It's perfectly fine. You need to be able to assess those situations kind of on the spot and individually. So keep that in mind, I guess, is that it's perfectly okay to be a deck that plays crazy cards or fast mana or tutors. We were just talking about tutors. It's perfectly okay. There's not a problem with it. It's just not something I enjoy. And if you find that it's not something you enjoy, then just try building your decks without tutors. If you're playing CDH, obviously you probably don't want to do that, but you don't have to play just one level of play. You can play super, super jank decks and CDH and everything in between. And that's what I do. That's how I have fun, is the variety there. Absolutely correct to do what you need to do to have fun, as long as you're respecting your opponent's time and making sure you're communicating with them.